Okay, they're walking up at the podium right now.
On Tuesday, my office filed a criminal complaint against defendant Buck for an incident on September 11th in which he injected the victim with a large dose of methamphetamine. Fortunately, that victim lived. The latest incident is further evidence that shows a troubling and disturbing pattern, especially given that defendant Buck was aware of the dangers of his behavior and that there was an ongoing investigation into the deaths of Mr. Moore and Mr. Dean. The surviving victims' statements gave us the break we needed. To have them be the one to bring the charges that they brought, but it was just a matter. We have done, and we will continue to do everything legally possible to put this depraved sexual predator away.
If you have such information. I've already noted the excellent. Today I am announcing a federal case against Mr. Buck, a case that charges him with distributing methamphetamine that directly resulted in the overdose death of Gemmel Moore, a 26-year-old man who died in Mr. Buck's West Hollywood apartment on July 27, 2017. As a result of the case filed last night in the United States District Court, District Attorney Jackie Lacey agreed that Mr. Buck should be transferred to federal custody to face charges that carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison and a maximum of life in prison without parole. Cooperatively with my prosecutors to address this threat to public safety. The evidence collected by members of the federal task force, which also includes the FBI, indicates that Mr. Buck brought Mr. Moore to Los Angeles for the purpose of engaging in sexual activity, and that Mr. Buck agreed to pay the victim with money and narcotics. During the investigation, Mr. Moore's mother told investigators that her son reported, months before his death, that Mr. Buck had, quote, held Mr. Moore against his will and shot him up with drugs, unquote. The criminal complaint alleging Mr. Buck caused the death of Mr. Moore is supported by a 21-page affidavit that outlines a disturbing pattern of Mr. Buck soliciting other men for sex in exchange for drugs and money. Investigators have located 10 additional victims, 9 of whom said Mr. Buck administered drugs to them or strongly encouraged them to ingest narcotics as part of agreements to be compensated for sexual services. The affidavit details how one man, who we have described as victim 1 in the affidavit, also died at Mr. Buck's West Hollywood apartment earlier this year.